according to St. Luke, the 23rd chapter. When they came to the place that's called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. And then Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. And they cast lots to divide his clothing. And the people stood by watching. But the leaders scoffed at him, saying, He saved others, let him save himself, if he is the Messiah of God, his chosen one. The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine, and saying, If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself. There was also an inscription over him, This is the King of the Jews. One of the criminals who were hanged there kept deriding him and saying, Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us. But the other rebuked him, saying, Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong. And then he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And he replied, Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. The gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Be seated. What do you think of when you hear the word king? Especially, what do you think of first? Let's reflect on that for just a moment. Well, of course, there's King Snakes, King Crab, Chicken a la King, King of the Mountain, and King of the Jungle. And the Los Angeles Kings in hockey or the Sacramento Kings in basketball, not to mention B.B. King, Stephen King, Carol King, and Martin Luther King. And don't forget the Burger King, the Lion King, and King Kong. And then there's all the other people, especially entertainers in particular, musicians and recording artists who've been acknowledged and hailed as king by their legions of adoring fans. So, for example, let me give you a category and see if you can tell me who that particular king is. And so if I say to you, the king of rock and roll, you would answer? Elvis Presley. Although I do have to tell you that both Little Richard and Chuck Berry have also been accorded that honor as well, just so you know. Let's try some more. The king of swing.
Benny Goodman.
Benny Goodman, very good. The king of soul.
Chuck Brown.
James Brown. The king of pop. Michael Jackson. The king of the blues. I already gave it away. B.B. King. The king of reggae. Bob Marley. The king of folk.
The king of hope.
Bob Dylan. The king of country.
Hank Williams.
See, I kind of struck out at that one too. I'm not a country music fan, but apparently,
Hank Williams.
no, George Strait,
Oh, come on.
king of country.
Oh, no.
How about the king of Hollywood? Shifting from music to movies for a second, sometimes just referred to, at least back in the day, as the king. Clark Gable, whoever had that, very good. Although you're dating yourself. Along with knowing Benny Goodman as well. There are also literal kings as well. Famous kings from history, for instance, who can forget Louis XIV of France, or King Henry VIII of England, or Tutankhamun of Egypt, or commonly remembered as King Tut. The word king, of course, has traditionally referred to a male, either a boy or a man, who is the ruler of a country. But again, as we've just seen, the word king can also be used to describe a boy or a man who is instead highly respected or very successful or popular. And it should come as no surprise then that in this age of celebrity, where so many seem to be clamoring for their so-called 15 minutes of fame, as Andy Warhol once put it, that recently parents have actually begun using royal designations like king or queen, prince or princess to actually name their children, seriously. In fact, the name King literally was the 256th most popular baby name in the United States back in 2013. So I decided to double check, and lo and behold, by 2018, I discovered that it was now the 150th most popular name for newborn males. Dr. Jean Twang, a psychologist and author of the book Narcissism Epidemic, once told ABC's Good Morning America that the rising popularity of these so-called royal-sounding baby names mirrors what she calls a current national preoccupation preoccupation with money and power and fame. It also reflects, I think, in these days when most of the world is no longer ruled by monarchs, the fact that these royal-sounding names and designations simply carry much less meaning, or at least a far different meaning than they once did during those earlier periods of history when monarchs did, in fact, rule most or all of the world. Someone known as a king today, for instance, is far less likely to be an actual ruler or monarch, and far more likely to be someone famous, or at least aspiring to be famous, I suppose. And so when we go back to the question I opened with this morning, what do you think of when you hear the word king? Most of us probably do not think immediately of rulers and monarchs. In a way, I believe the word has become watered down somewhat, diluted. In other words, it no longer carries with it the same images and connotations of power and prestige. And yet, here we are on the final Sunday of the church year, as I said at the outset, celebrating a festival called Christ the King. I don't know about you, but to me, the very designation at first glance seems hopelessly outdated. Someone even once wrote, the present position of Christ in the church may be likened to that of a king in a limited constitutional monarchy. The king in such a country is no more than a traditional rallying point, a pleasant symbol of unity and loyalty, much like a flag or national anthem. He is lauded and feted and supported, but his real authority is small. Nominally, he's head over all, but in every crisis, someone else makes the decisions. On formal occasions, he appears in his royal attire to deliver some tame, colorless speech put into his mouth by the real rulers of the country. The whole thing may be no more than good-natured make-believe, but it is rooted in antiquity. It's a lot of fun, and no one really wants to give it up. In other words, to summarize this whole idea of Christ the King Sunday, much less celebrating it, seems a lot like an old, worn-out tradition that no longer carries any real meaning or significance. One that we simply maintain for nostalgic reasons. That is to say, in a world where kings no longer actually rule, calling Christ a king is probably not all that helpful or relevant. Now, on the other hand, if we were to call today Christ the President Sunday or Christ the CEO Sunday, it might just make a little more sense to us. But here's the thing. There's something pretty interesting, pretty significant actually, about the designation Christ the King, and it's the word Christ itself. The word Christ, you see, is from the Greek word Christos, which in turn comes from the Hebrew word Messiah, literally the anointed one. And the Hebrew word Messiah is the designation of the God-appointed king of the end of time. In other words, when we use that designation, Christ the King, what we're actually saying is something like the King of Kings, and especially the one who will rule when God's kingdom is finally and fully realized. 1 Timothy 6, we even read, I charge you to keep the commandment without spot or blemish till the manifestation of our Lord Jesus Christ, which he will bring about at the right time, who is also the blessed and only sovereign, the King of kings and Lord of lords. Likewise, also referring to Christ, Revelation 7:14 says, for he is the Lord of lords, King of kings. And in Revelation 19:16, on his robe he has a name inscribed, King of kings and Lord of lords. And so he's not just any old king, this Jesus, is he? He's the King of kings, number one, big cheese, head honcho, the supreme authority who completely dominates and dwarfs every other king, every earthly monarch or ruler. And that's whether they're actually called a king or not. Because when we consider this morning's reading from Colossians, this is made abundantly clear. We have been rescued, says Colossians, from the power of darkness and transferred into the kingdom of his beloved Son. And here's something else to consider. In recent years, we've heard a lot, both good and bad, about this whole idea of nationalism. That is the feeling of being loyal to and proud of one's country, often taken together with the belief that ours is somehow better or more important than any other country. But the question is simply this, is our primary and highest loyalty or allegiance, as Christians, mind you, to be directed solely towards our country or a particular nation here on earth? Apparently not, since we have been, as our reading tells us, transferred to an entirely different kingdom, a different realm, the one ruled by God's Son. While he was Secretary of State during the Reagan presidency, George Shultz kept a large globe in his office. And whenever newly appointed ambassadors had an interview with him, or ambassadors returning home from their posts overseas stopped by for a visit, and they were leaving his office, Schultz would always test them, and he would say, "You have to go over to that globe and prove to me that you can identify your country," meaning the country where they served, of course. And so they would go over, spin the globe, and put their finger on the country to which they had been assigned. Unerringly, no mistakes. And then, when Schultz's old friend and the former Senate Majority Leader, Mike Mansfield, was appointed ambassador to Japan, even he was put to the test. This time, however, Ambassador Mansfield spun the globe and put his hand on the United States of America instead, and said to Schultz, "This is my country." And years later, Schultz admitted that he started telling that story to every ambassador he subsequently met with. "Never forget," he now told them, "you're over there in that country, but your country is the United States." Well, let's stop and think. The very same dynamic is at work here in today's reading, isn't it? As Christians, we live in the world, and as American Christians, this is our country, but our true kingdom, our true home, is in the kingdom of God. And that's where our primary and highest allegiance and loyalty must always be directed. Ray Kroc, the man responsible for the unbelievable growth and success of the McDonald's restaurant chain, used to say that the three most important things in his life were God, his family, and McDonald's, in that order. That is, until he got to the office, then the order was reversed. As Christians, however, we should never reverse the order. We are ambassadors of Christ wherever we go, and wherever we live, and whatever we do. Our behavior and words must always represent the one whom we serve. Why? Because again, God's kingdom is no ordinary kingdom, just as Jesus is no ordinary king. He's the image of the invisible God, says our reading. As Jesus once pointed out to the disciple Philip, "Whoever has seen me has seen the Father." Or as we read in John 1:18, no one has ever seen God. It's God, the only Son, who's close to the Father's heart, who has made him known. The Greek word for image here has found its way into the English language as the word icon. You know, those little images on our computer screens that we click on. As the Reverend Fred Anderson once explained, the world of computers gives us an immediate illustration. When you click on an icon, he says, the program behind it opens up to you, and you find yourself transported into its wonderful world. This is what the church confesses about Jesus, says Anderson. He's not only the Christ of God, he is the one to whom you and I can be drawn into the very presence of the invisible God. He is the icon of God, the image of the invisible. And Jesus is also the firstborn of all creation, says our reading. For in him all things in heaven and on earth were created, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or powers, all things have been created through him and for him. In him all things were created, including all other thrones and dominions and rulers and powers. Again, he is the King of kings. There was once a preacher in the 19th century in Scandinavia who heard one Sunday morning that the king himself would be present at worship that day. And understandably rattled, he decided to ditch his previously prepared sermon and instead chose to speak about the Christian values of their king. A sermon, I might add, that went on and on and on in its praise of the monarch. And even though the king said nothing after the service, the preacher could not help but wonder if he might receive some sort of reward for his effusive praise and loyal support. And sure enough, a short time later, a very large crate was delivered to the church. And immediately the priest concluded that his reward had arrived. And so he pried open the crate only to discover a life-sized crucifix inside. He could hardly contain his disappointment. "We've got tons of crucifixes already," he thought to himself bitterly. But as he looked deeper into the crate, he saw a letter bearing the royal seal. So excitedly he opened it. And the letter contained the king's instructions as to the placement of this crucifix. It was to go on the western wall of the church, wrote the king, directly across from the pulpit. This was intentional, apparently, so that the preacher, said the king, would always be reminded of which king he should be preaching about. In a few short weeks, we'll gather once again for worship on Christmas Eve and listen to the poetic opening verses of John, which read in part, He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. Jesus was there at the startup, in other words. He got in on the ground floor. He didn't inherit his kingdom as much as he created it. Our reading continues. He himself is before all things, and in him all things hold together. In other words, Christ is the glue that holds us and this entire world together. He didn't just create it and then walk away and leave it to its own devices, like the master clock builder that some of our founding fathers imagined God to be. No, Jesus created the world and then has stayed intimately involved with it. No absent landlord is he. He's the head of the body, the church, continues our reading. Again, Jesus has promised to be with us always, to be active in our lives and in the affairs of this world, to be a constant presence. Sam Bronfman was the former CEO of the Seagram Company, one of the largest distillers of alcoholic beverages in the entire world in its day. And once he entered a crowded conference room, he was anxious to get on with the meeting, apparently, so he plopped down in the nearest chair. And one of his young assistants immediately protested, "Oh, no, Mr. Bronfman, you're supposed to sit at the head of the table." "Young man," he replied, "wherever I sit is the head of the table." He was making it very clear, wasn't he, that he was in charge no matter where he sat. And the same is true for Jesus. Instead of a crown of gold decorated with jewels, his was made of thorns. Instead of mounting a throne, Jesus was raised upon a cross. Wherever he happens to be, Jesus is in charge wherever he goes. He's the boss. And he chose time and time again while he was on this earth to be with the weakest, the most vulnerable, and the most despised of this world. For those would be the ones he said to inherit his kingdom. Those were the ones he had a particular interest in touching with his love. It was Napoleon Bonaparte, the French general and emperor, who once wrote, "Alexander, Caesar, Charlemagne, myself, we all founded empires. But on what foundation did we rest the creation of our genius? Upon force." Jesus Christ, he wrote, founded an empire upon love. And even at this hour, millions of men would die for him. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. And through him God was pleased to reconcile all things by making peace through the blood of his cross. God's priority to reconcile all things to himself is also Christ's priority. And it needs to be our priority as well. We live in a broken world in need of fixing, a hurting world in need of healing, a hate-filled world in need of Christ's redeeming love. Several years ago, because of all the tornadoes in the area, a developer in Tulsa, Oklahoma, offered an optional tornado/safe room in the new homes that he was selling. 9 of the first 10 buyers took him up on the offer and opted to pay the extra $2,500 for the room, which can also be used as a closet, a bathroom, even a vault when not needed for safety. However, the 10th couple, both 75 years old, opted for a hot tub instead. They just wanted to live out the rest of their lives in comfort, they informed him. Obviously, their priorities were different. And so what about ours? Given the choice between following the King of Kings in the way of love and reconciliation, a way, keep in mind, that will not always be easy, especially when the brokenness and the hurt and the hate of this world all close in on us, or choosing to live out the rest of our lives seeking only comfort, which will we choose? That's the question to be answered this day and every day. For those of you who are basketball fans, and if you've ever watched the NBA on TNT, then you may know a commentator by the name of Ernie Johnson, who several years ago went out on a limb and briefly commented on politics and faith instead of just the game that night. This took place right after the 2016 election, as a matter of fact. And in a remarkable admission, he confessed this: "I never know from one election to the next who is going to be in the Oval Office, but I always know who is on the throne. And I'm on this earth because God created me, and that's who I answer to. I'm a Christian, and I follow this guy named Jesus you may have heard of. And the greatest commandment he gave me was to love others." I don't think you can say it any better than that. Nor do I think that there's any better way to sum up the meaning of Christ the King Sunday, or what our hope in Christ is all about. We follow this guy named Jesus above any and all earthly rulers or politicians. He is the one who was there at the beginning of the world and still guides and inspires us to this very day. And his gracious and glorious reign can be summed up in a single word, and that word is love. It's the love of Christ demonstrated on the cross that informs and transforms us. It's the love of Christ that defines who and whose we are. It's the love of Christ that directs our words and actions. And it's the love of Christ that gives us the hope that we need to carry on in this life and the ability to persevere when the going gets tough. Amen.